So today we're going to be looking into the book of Ruth, and particularly into the book of Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 18. And the title of this preach is Love and God's Perfect Plan. So just for a little bit of context, the book of Ruth follows the story primarily of two women. One of those women is called Naomi. She's an Israelite woman. And it also follows the story of her daughter-in-law, a lady called Ruth. And it follows them on their journey from despair and mourning through to hope and eventual redemption. The story takes place in the Old Testament, so before the time of Jesus. It takes place in the time of the Judges, which was a very dark time for the people of Israel. A lot of people had turned away from God. It was not a good time at all. And certainly in the time of the book of Ruth, that was certainly the case, because they were in a time of famine. And for that reason, Naomi had decided to leave her hometown of Bethlehem and travel to the land of Moab, which was traditionally a place which was, that they were the enemies of God's people, the enemies of Israel. So she travels with her husband and her two sons, and she goes to the land of Moab. But while she's there, they don't experience better times because her husband dies. On the plus side, her two sons marry two Moabite women called Orpah and Ruth. But darkness is still around the corner from them even then, because the two sons then also die. So Naomi is left with Ruth and Orpah in this land that isn't her own land. And hearing that the land of Judah has escaped from famine and things are a little bit better, she decides then to return to the town of Bethlehem, but telling her daughter-in-laws that they should really stay in the land of Moab, the land where their parents are, the land of their people, the land of their gods, and leave her just to travel back to Bethlehem on her own. While Orpah agrees to do this reluctantly, Ruth insists that she won't do that. In fact, she says this to Naomi. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." So they travel back to Bethlehem. That's Naomi and Ruth. And that's where we pick up the story in chapter 2. And now I think Tony is going to come up and just read the passage from Ruth 2, 1 to 18.
Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Amalek, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done to your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to leave, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth leaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, so God is love is a statement that you might have heard before. But what exactly does God is love mean? I mean, after all, a lot of people think of God or love rather, in a different way. They might think of their love for a football team. There's a man who's very upset because his football team has lost. That's not a Scotland shirt. I wouldn't be as cruel as to do that, Andrew. That's a Wimbledon shirt, I believe. Some people say they love Taylor Swift. That person down there on the left-hand side has gone to a Taylor Swift gig covered in a towel so that the people at work won't see she's skiving off work. Or him, I don't know what sex that person is. But also people love sort of film franchises sometimes, or they might see love as being this sort of romantic, beautiful love as depicted there in the left-hand corner. But what we see in this passage that Tony's just read is an example of God's love, as shown, as reflected by Ruth and Boaz, the two main characters in this story. And it also gives us a glimpse into God's perfect plan, both for them and also, symbolically, for the whole world. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to talk about the love of Ruth and the love of Boaz as shown in this story, first of all. Oops. Okay, so I've chosen to depict Ruth there as a cat with a love heart, which is very appropriate, hopefully. So first, we see the love of Ruth, and I think we saw that in chapter 1 as well in the context that I gave earlier. She's shown great love, and it's also mentioned in this chapter as well, the love that she's shown to her mother-in-law by choosing to leave the land of her parents, land of her birth, and to come to Bethlehem. It's a selfless type of love that goes against all logic, because Naomi, after all, her mother-in-law told her that there was absolutely no future for her in the land of Judah. It would be hard for her to find a husband or to find any joy. And yet she chose to follow Naomi out of love and loyalty to her mother-in-law. She also chose to follow a God that was not her God and to live in the land of a people who might be hostile to her. So this goes against all logic. This is what is called agape love. It's an unconditional love and a self-sacrificial love. And as chapter 2 begins, we see Ruth showing another act of loyalty and love by literally going out and putting food on the table for her and Naomi by doing a very humble task, and that's the task of gleaning. Verse 2 talks about this because Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go out to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." And verse 3 says, "So she went out, entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters." So this is a task of gleaning, and like I say, it's a very humble task. It's basically going along and picking up the scraps behind the harvesters. It was something that was a law for Jewish landowners to do, just to show an act of benevolence towards poor people in the community. That might be orphans, it might be widows, it might be migrants, just poorer people who can't afford to buy food themselves. And so it was an act of love by the landowners to allow them to pick up some sort of leftover grain. But obviously this is a humble task. As Ruth does this, she enters a field owned by somebody called Boaz. who verse 3 tells us is from the same clan as Naomi's late husband Elimelech. And here, as Ruth meets this relative, Boaz, we find that her acts of kindness to her mother-in-law have not gone unnoticed in the community. So Boaz tells Ruth, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before." So Ruth's selfless attitude and her faith to pick a route in life that seemed hopeless and trusting in a foreign god and the provision of that god, even though it wasn't a Moabite god, it was the God of Israel, the same God that we worship, was making a mark on people and it was inspiring others. And we find out later that God would honour this faith. But first, before we look into that a little bit more, I just want to talk about the love that Boaz shows in this passage. So here I've chosen to depict Boaz as a puppy. It's just to use some cute pictures for the preach, more than any relevance to the story. But Boaz, I think, shows a very similar type of godly love to Ruth. Even though he's rich, she's poor, it doesn't matter. They still show this same sort of humility, this same sort of humble love. We see from the outset, with the choice of words he uses, that this is a man of God, at least in the way he talks. In verse 4 it reads, "Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. 'The Lord be with you.' 'The Lord bless you,' they answered." And indeed, when Boaz later commends Ruth on the love she shows for her mother-in-law, he says this. He says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge." So as you can see here, he's using godly words. He seems to be a man of God, but he also, rather than just saying these things, he also shows it in his actions. He puts it into action. He isn't the type to just say, "God bless you," or "God reward you," and then walk off home, or because he's busy, do something else. And he's also not the sort of person who's going to say he'll pray for her and then just walk off, which isn't such a bad thing. But what he wants to do is take it one step forward, and he wants to basically become God's hands and feet. He wants to deliver that reward that he talks about by his kindness, by the love that he shows this woman. It's quite possible that he's extremely busy, but he has time, he finds time to show love and to go above and beyond. He shows grace to this Gentile woman, this outsider, without prejudice. And I think it's something we can probably relate to. At the moment, Ireland is a place that's welcomed a lot of people from a lot of different countries seeking shelter. And Boaz, I think, offers us a great example of how we should welcome people who are outsiders, people outside of our communities, even people inside our communities, and make them feel welcome, accepted, and loved. But Boaz does this, and he does a lot more. He goes above and beyond his legal obligation to allow people to glean. He offers Ruth protection. He offers her abundant food and refreshment and a warm welcome and an equality, so she feels an impartiality in the way he deals with her. He even offers her the chance to sit down with the harvesters and with him and eat and drink as an equal in their company. And I'll just show you how he does this in the passage. So in Ruth 2:8 and 9 it says, So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So actually, Boaz shows even more love than that. Because we find that Ruth actually goes home with an overabundance of grain after her gleaning that day. Verse 17 tells us that the amount that she took home amounted to about an ephah, which is about 5.5 kilograms. So if you can imagine, this is a lot of grain. This is a lot of stuff to put on the table. Later in the story of Ruth, we find out that she was allowed to glean in the field for the whole harvest, because verse 23 reads, So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. So this love shown by Boaz is basically an amazing generosity with amazing humility. It's rooted in God, it's clothed in humility, and it's brought to life through his actions. It reflects basically the love of God. And you'll notice he doesn't seem to do it as an obligation, he does it with a smile on his face. He does it lovingly and without having to do it. And I think as well as reflecting God's love here, there is a deeper sort of symbolic meaning in this picture that the Bible provides of Boaz and the way that he's portrayed actually throughout the book of Ruth. Because I think we can see potentially here that there is a real picture of Jesus given in this picture that's built up of the character Boaz. I think this is very intentional. To the early readers, to the Jewish people before the time of Jesus, I think it offered them a glimpse, almost a prophetic glimpse, of what was to come, of who Jesus, who their Saviour might be. I think to us, reading it in the context that we know Jesus has come, we know who he is, we see who he is, and we see what he's done for us, I think there are reminders of Jesus in the way that Boaz acts in this book. Like Jesus, Boaz offers grace to a Gentile woman, and he offers her protection. He offers her love and provision and incredible generosity. And more than that, later in chapter 2, we discover that Boaz is actually somebody called a guardian redeemer of Ruth's family. Naomi explains in verse 20 of chapter 2, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Now, what is a guardian redeemer? Well, a guardian redeemer, or a kinsman redeemer, as it says in some translations, means that Boaz is a relative with an obligation to look after Naomi's family and redeem or buy any land if there's a risk that that land might be lost to the family line. We actually find out that later in the story of Ruth that Boaz does exactly that. He buys the land of Naomi, giving her a more prosperous future, giving her a hope for the future, and he actually redeems Ruth as well, makes her his wife. So he is a guardian redeemer. And I think the word redeemer reminds us of Jesus quite naturally, because in Galatians 3:13 we hear about the fact that Christ has redeemed us. He's bought us. He's paid the price for our freedom. So Galatians 3:13 and 14 reads, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. So just as Boaz will later redeem Naomi, a Jew, and Ruth, a Gentile, so Jesus paid the full price to redeem us, both Jew and Gentile. And there are other parallels. The fact this is taking place in a time of harvest is one of those. But also the fact that this story takes place in the town of Bethlehem, which we find out is the birthplace of Jesus. I think there are parallels here which point us to one thing, and I think it's pointing us to God's ultimate plan and love, the plan which would open the way for us to become children of God, and that is his plan through the death and resurrection of Jesus to save us all. Okay. So next I just want to talk about the way that the God of love is shown in this chapter, and I think we've already covered that to some extent, but what can we learn from it? There's a lot going on in this chapter, as I've said, symbolically and in real life, but everything I think points to God's love. I think Boaz and Ruth really reflect God's love in a way that makes an impact and that glorifies God. And I think it's a passage that has great relevance to us today because it presents a challenge and sets an example for us to follow. Jesus will later teach in this way. He will give us the challenge to do this. He says, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And Romans 13:10 is one of the many New Testament verses that tell us that such love is actually the essence of God's law. Romans 13:10 reads, "Love your neighbour as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbour, therefore love is the fulfilment of the law." So just as Ruth and Boaz reflect the love of God, I think we should actually ask God and pray to God for opportunities to show the love of God to others. We should also ask God to help us see those opportunities, because there may be opportunities already around us that we're maybe not taking. Chances to show the love of God to people in our church, chances to show the love of God to people in our family, perhaps chance to show the love of God particularly to people we don't know, to unbelievers, so that we can reflect the love of God and inspire them. You may have had people in your life you remember as showing you great examples of love. They may have been Christian, they may have been non-Christian, but people may have brought you on your journey towards God just by showing you love, not by necessarily reading you a Bible verse, but by showing you natural love that has inspired and surprised you. Indeed, I know there are many people in this church who have, through their love, have invited people to church, or who have just inspired people to come to church just by the way they treat them, by the love that they show them. And this is a challenge not just for the odd people who do that, but to everybody. It's a challenge for all of us, not just for the few. It's not a work, it's actually a privilege, and it's nothing to boast about either, because all we're doing is just showing the love of God through the Holy Spirit. The price, if we don't do it, is also quite heavy, because if we don't do it, if we don't reflect God's love, then it can become a stumbling block for people in coming to faith. Some people will turn away from faith because of the way they've been treated wrongly by people not showing the love of God in church. But equally, I don't think this passage gives us an excuse to feel self-righteous if we're doing good stuff and showing the love of God. And it's also not an excuse to bash people in the church or to bash the church at all. But I think the love that Boaz and Ruth show can be put up as a mirror to us and an example, so that we can follow in their footsteps and show love to others. In fact, the loving interactions that we have with people, just like the interactions that Ruth and Boaz had in that field on that day, I believe are all part of God's perfect plan. They're a chance for us, these opportunities that we have to show God's love, are all a chance to glorify God, and they're all part of the things that God has put in our path as part of our plan for our life. Ephesians 2:10 reads, "For we are all God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Indeed, I think, just to sum up, the book of Ruth and the passage we've read today shows God's love, not just through Boaz and through Ruth in the way they act, but also in the plan that God has for Ruth and Naomi. Because later in the book, we discover that Ruth's meeting with Boaz that day was not a chance event, and in fact that God had a perfect plan for her and Naomi from the beginning. In fact, this plan was even in existence when they were going through all that hardship, when they were going through the times of mourning. God always knew where he was taking them. Ruth went to Bethlehem with little hope for the future. Naomi actually was incredibly bitter towards God and didn't see that there was a bright future for her either. But God had a better plan, and he had a much bigger picture for them. I think in terms of the relevance of that for us, I think we can see that there is a purpose and a plan in our lives too. It may not be grand, it may not be easy, it may not always be the route that we like. In fact, it may just be a tiny thing. God's plan for our lives may be a tiny thing by just meeting somebody or showing somebody God's love. God may have a bigger plan for us, but God will always have a perfect plan for our lives and what happens. It doesn't mean we're going to have an easy life, and it doesn't actually mean that plan will be revealed and obvious to us in this lifetime. Indeed, while Ruth will see the evidence of God's plan in her lifetime, The actual biggest part of God's plan for Ruth actually happened generations later. She wouldn't actually see it in her lifetime. Because incredibly, this Gentile bride, this poor widow and her mother-in-law who thought they had no future, Ruth would go on to marry Boaz. She would have a son, and she would later become the great-great-grandmother of King David and would become part of the bloodline of Jesus Christ himself. So God's plan for Ruth was bigger than she could have ever imagined. She would become an ancestor of Christ. Imagine if she, during her lifetime, would know the impact of what her life would have on the world. So this is the love of God as reflected in Ruth and Boaz, in the way they act with people, the way they show God's love. But it's also showing God's love through his perfect plan for them and also for the world. Because this meeting in a barley field, literally, historically and symbolically, points to the greatest love of all, and that is the love of God through Jesus Christ. So through our gratitude, let's reflect God's love in our lives, just like Ruth and Boaz, and in the way we treat people.